Welcome to Across Africa, our weekly look at stories from across the continent. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith, and this week, World Press Freedom Day was a chance to take stock of some of the continent's success stories, like Namibia and the Seychelles, which is one of the rare African countries where most journalists are women. Elsewhere, like in Eritrea and Egypt, journalists still face life-threatening risks. Also, there are calls for the government in Congo Brazzaville to do more to identify and support those suffering from mental illness. It's a neglected issue across the continent, and the fallout can have devastating consequences. And more African countries are seeing the upside of companies considering the environmental and social well-being of their employees and customers. We meet some of the women in Benin who say they have more opportunities and support at work because of this shift. But first, for World Press Freedom Day, NGO Reporters Without Borders set out a diverse landscape across the continent. Whilst parts of Africa have seen some improvements and rank highly for freedom of the press, other countries have seen an increase in state-led repression, persecution, and even killings of journalists. Sam Bradpeace tells us more from West Africa.
West Africa is a mixed bag when it comes to press freedom, at least according to a new ranking of 180 countries compiled by the organisation Reporters Without Borders. Some countries in the region, like Nigeria, Mali, Benin, ranked well below the global average for press freedom. On the other end of the scale, you had places like Ivory Coast and Sierra Leone performing relatively well. Now, here in Senegal, during the mass protests which followed the arrest of the main opposition leader last year, a number of press freedoms were curtailed. Journalists and media houses, including the publisher of a major national newspaper, were attacked. You also had two private TV stations having their broadcast licenses suspended. The government blamed the media for stoking tensions and provoking protests following that arrest. Now, partly as a result of this, Senegal has actually slipped from 49th globally to 73rd globally in terms of press freedom. Elsewhere on the continent, the Seychelles performed particularly well, coming in 13th in that global ranking. The worst performing country on the continent was Djibouti, which came in at 179th. That's the second worst performing country in the world in terms of press freedom, behind North Korea.
Across the continent, people suffering from mental illness or injury can really struggle to get the help and support that they need. The neglect of their conditions can have devastating consequences. Earlier this year in Congo Brazzaville, the issue was brought starkly into focus after a woman suffering from dementia killed a baby. That sparked more calls for the government to offer better care. Our team reports.
Viviane Jankolea spends most of her days looking for her nephew in the streets of Pointe-Noire, Congo's second-largest city. The young man suffers from a personality disorder and often runs away from home.
We were worried about his recurring headaches, so on the advice of a neighbour, we went to church and then to hospital. After the staff examined him and prescribed him medication, his condition improved, but he relapsed a month later.
Despite being diagnosed more than a decade ago, Viviane's nephew has never been properly monitored by a doctor. Like hundreds of mentally ill patients across the country, he receives no support from the government. Dr. Dauphin Matemolo is the only psychiatrist in Pointe-Noire. The city has been without a psychiatric ward since the 1980s.
I have no choice but to send patients home, and I do this with great sorrow, because as their doctor, I see how they behave, I see how unstable they are, how aggressive they can be, both verbally and physically. But I ask them to go home because there are no facilities to look after them.
To improve access to adequate care, the Congolese government launched a national mental health program in 2019. But 3 years on, it remains both understaffed and underfunded. The death of a baby at the end of March, torn from his mother's arms and thrown to the ground by a patient who'd never received treatment, could, however, give a boost to its implementation.
This tragic event has been a wake-up call for us. We want to make sure it never happens again. But to be successful, we need more support from our partners to tackle the problem of mentally ill patients wandering the streets.
The National Mental Health Programme estimates that across the country, 1,500 mentally ill patients have no access to medical care.
European sanctions on Russia because of the war in Ukraine have caused a major disruption to global energy supplies. That's created an opportunity, though, for South African coal producers. Despite the environmental costs, they're racing to sell their stock to keen European clients. Our team in Cape Town tells us more.
In Johannesburg's business district, there is a silver lining to the war in Ukraine. This businessman used to sell his coal to Asian countries. He is now being courted by European clients.
Naturally, there are two big suppliers that could replace Russian coal to Europe. It is Colombia and South Africa. And we are getting a lot of inquiries from Europe, and we started selling coal to them. We got skilled workforce, we got infrastructure, we got no issues regarding mining coal. But the issue is taking it to a port and then moving it efficiently from the port.
His company has over 1 million tons of industrial anthracite stock. Its biggest challenge is moving this commodity to be exported. South Africa's railways are damaged, and instead trucks are transporting the coal stock to port so it can be shipped. This is much more expensive than expected, but it can be done because prices have shot up. Since the crisis, the price of coal increased from 100 to more than 300 euros per ton. For this analyst, the profits are enormous. Exports are exploding.
Year on year, we exported 900% more in April than last year. So in other words, it's increased 10 times. So what we exported in 2021 has increased 10 times in 2022 to Europe.
But this surge in exports comes at a time when South African authorities promised to reduce coal production. Europe even offered South Africa more than 8 billion euros to help with its energy transition. Keeping the commitments made at COP26 in Glasgow could become increasingly challenging considering the coal industry's latest profits.
The president of the Central African Republics made Bitcoin an official currency. It's now legal tender alongside the CFA franc. It's only the second nation in the world to do so. The move, though, has been criticised by some who say it's premature and exclusionary in a country where only 10 to 15% of residents have internet access. Laurent Berstecker has the story.
Placing the Central African Republic on the map of the world's boldest and most visionary countries. That's how Central African authorities described their decision to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. But in the streets of Bangui, not everyone was aware of the move or even knew what Bitcoin was.
It's the first time I'm hearing of this. I don't know.
Do you have internet?
No, I don't.
The bill was adopted on Wednesday, but opposition MPs say they intend to challenge it in court. They argue the law's only purpose is to undermine the use of the CFA franc, a colonial-era currency backed by France and pegged to the euro, and that's still being used in 6 African countries. Many experts also warned of the risks of using Bitcoin, known for its wild and unpredictable swings. In 2021, its value oscillated between 31 and 64,000 euros. But for young, more tech-savvy Central Africans, cryptocurrency could bring about more flexibility in a country where the informal sector represents almost half of the economy.
Cryptocurrency has a huge potential for the region. To borrow or speculate, you always have to go through traditional banks, and they don't make it easy.
But with only a fraction of the country's population connected to the internet, many experts have questioned the timing of the law, which comes as Russia, a close ally of Central African authorities, is looking for ways to bypass international sanctions.
More and more African companies are changing the way that they operate in light of the impact that they have on society. And that doesn't just mean financial. Corporate social responsibility initiatives look at the well-being of staff and customers more holistically. Our team went to Benin, where businesses are taking more notice of the needs of their female employees.
Every morning, Karel Sakbo drops off her 3-year-old daughter in a nursery that, unusually, is run on-site at the Beninese company where she works.
It allows me to be more productive at work. Before she would stay at home, which is an hour away. It was hard to hear from her because I had to wait for my break. Now that she's right next door, it reassures me.
Around 40% of staff here is female. Managers are trying to make sure that family obligations don't negatively affect women's career more than men's.
The young Beninese girls are part of a generation that want to control their future. They're happy to be given this support. It's time for all business leaders to understand that at some point we must participate in gender balance at work.
In Africa, societal pressures can often throw up obstacles to employed mothers. The principles of corporate social responsibility help challenge sexist prejudices that often stop working women from taking advantage of the opportunities that they have earned.
The feminization of leadership allows the company to upgrade itself, especially when the company wants to enter the European market.
North of Cotonou, the management of a construction company has decided to put more women in high-level positions. This electrical technician is the first woman to manage a concrete plant. This engineer is the lead at a construction site in the heart of Benin's largest city.
We have another way of approaching the people we work with, of making them achieve their goals. There is something very pragmatic about women's management. We multitask, we know how to get straight to the point.
Women bring valuable input to the development of our economies. So it's normal that construction companies like ours are feeling the difference.
In Benin, 67% of companies reportedly engaged in corporate social responsibility. But there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of awareness and training. For now, the majority of organizations that have started to implement CSR practices tend to be multinationals, NGOs, and foreign companies.
Well, that's it for Across Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.